Hi everyone, welcome to the Blazor WebAssembly Cookie Authentication series. Okay, this is the first part of the series. In this video, we are going to authenticate our Blazor WebAssembly application with the .NET cookie without using any frameworks like Microsoft Identity .NET Core or the Identity Server 4. Okay, we are simply use the .NET Core cookie for authenticating the user. So in the next part of the series, we are going to implement external login providers like Twitter, Google, and Facebook, Microsoft, etc. Okay, so this is a simple diagrammatic representation of how cookie-based authentication works. Okay, here you can see API project and Blazor WebAssembly project. Okay, where API is the project that runs at the server, and Blazor WebAssembly is the project that runs in the user browser. Okay, whenever a user requested with a login request to the API with valid credentials, then on success, API will return a authentication cookie. Okay, so that cookie will be carried out for every API request to make that request as user as authenticated user. Okay, here is the small user table that I am going to use for my authentication. Okay, like email, first name, last name, password, and external login name. Okay, so just a sample table, and here you can see for the demo purpose I am saving the password directly as it is, but in the real application we should hash it. Okay, now as a first step, let's create a API project. Here I am using .NET CLI for creating the project. So the command is like .NET new web API -o and name of your project. Okay, let's create my project. Okay, project is successfully created. Let me open my project. So here is my .NET 6 web API project. Okay, to communicate with the database, I am going to use the NT framework code. So let's install required packages into my application. So the first package I want to install, that is Microsoft.NT framework core. Okay, copy the command, install the package. The second package I am going to install is Microsoft.NT framework core.SQL server. Install it. Okay, now let's create a class for our user table. Create a folder like data. Inside of it, create a folder like entities. Okay, inside of entities, add a class like user.cs. Into this user class, let's add our table columns as properties. Okay, this is our user class. Now let's create database context. Okay, inside of the data folder, let me create a database context like cookie auth context. Okay, to make this context class as a database context class, it should inherit DB context. Okay, now create the constructor and define DB context options. And give our class name as its type, options, and pass it to the base class. Now register the user class here. Okay. To do that, we can use bbset, and its type should be our user class. Okay. So that is our database context class. Now we have to define a constant string for our database context. So we will do it in app settings.development.json. Here we can add default property like connection string. Inside of it, let me create a new property like key auth connection. Okay. So you add your connection string here. After adding connection string in program.cs file, let's define our database context class. Add db context, and here we have to define our class type. Use SQL server. Okay. Import the namespace, and here we have to pass our connection string. To do that, builder.configurations.get connection string. Here pass our connection string property name. Okay. So that's all about registering the our database context. Okay, next create our controller, auth controller, and where we are going to define an action method for user login, where on successful login, we are going to create a authenticated cookie. Okay, add a new controller like auth controller. Into our controller constructor, let's inject our context class. Okay. Now, before creating login action method, first let's create a model, that is login model. Okay, let's create a new folder like dtos and create a class like login dto. To this class, let's add properties like email and password. Okay, now let's add our action method, that is http post method, and we name it as login async. Okay. Okay, this is my method. Its input parameter is login DTO type. Okay, and let's decorate our method with HTTP post. Okay, and let me also add a route for it like login. Okay, as a first step, let's fetch the user information from the database. Okay, where user equal to await auth cookie context dot user email compare with our payload email. Okay, and next we have to compare the password. For demo purpose, I have stored raw password as it is, but you should always hash the password while storing, and comparing also we should hash the password, and that hashed password must be compared. But the demo purpose I am using password, which is strictly not recommended. Okay. Along with this, I want to check one more, that is external, and I have missed one more column here in the user, that is external login name. Means here I am going to store, if it is external login like Google, Facebook, I will store those names. For this demo, we are simply storing .NET cookie, right? Which is not an external one, so it will be null. So what I will do here, I will check for external cookie also. So that with this comparison, what we are making, same email can have direct account in our database, or it can have a same email with another account for Google, or same email with another account for Facebook, like that, based on your business requirement. Okay, we can implement. If you want to unique for one email, then we no need to consider this column while fetching the user. Okay. Okay, fetches the user data. For suppose with those credentials, if you don't have user data, we simply return as a bad request. Like message like invalid credentials. Okay. And if the user is valid, then we have to prepare the claims. So where claims equal to define list of claims. So the claim collection here we are defining will be added into our authentication cookie. So in these claims, I want to store just user ID and the email address. Okay. So claim, I will name it like user ID. I will store user.id.to string, and I will store email claim. So there is some default claim type names. Okay. Like email, user dot, our user should be awaited. Okay. And now we can call email property. So that's my claim collection. Next, I want to create a claims identity. Okay, where claims identity object. Let's define the object. New claims identity. And first parameter, I want to pass this object, that is collection of claims, so that we have just created. Okay. And second claim is the name of the authentication. Okay. So here I am using simple cookie based authentication, right? Cookie. Okay. And authentication scheme. This is nothing but a constant which names cookies. Okay. So that is like that we have to create the claims identity object. And for now, let's create a auth properties. Let's assign a authentication properties object. Okay. For now, let's define the empty object. Okay. Now we can use framework default method for signing in the user. Okay. So to do that, await HTTP context sign in. Okay. By default, .NET Framework supports the cookie-based authentication. We no need any additional frameworks like Microsoft Identity Core like that. Okay. So first parameter will be the name of the authentication. So same name what we have defined here. Copy that and assign it here. Okay. And second, we have to initialize claims principal. To that claims principal, I need to pass the claims identity. Okay. And third property will be our auth properties. Okay. So that's it. So this signing method creates the authenticated cookie by adding the claims into that cookie. Okay. Finally, simply return the success message. Okay. This is our login endpoint for the user. Okay. Now let's create another project that is Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay. Okay. Here is my comment for creating the Blazor WebAssembly application that is .NET New BlazorWasm -o cookie. Sorry, -o name of your project. So let me create the Blazor WebAssembly project. Okay. Project is created successfully. Let me open in the Visual Studio Code Editor. So here is our .NET 6 Blazor WebAssembly application. Let's create a one more pages component that is Login.razor. Okay, let's define route like /login with page director. Okay, now let's add here small HTML form. Okay, that contains email and password text boxes. Here I have small form snippet. Okay, where I have two text boxes. One is for email and another is for password and a button for submitting the form. Okay. Now to enable model binding with this form, we need to create a model. For that, in our Blazor WebAssembly application, create a folder like models. Inside of it, let's create a model like login model. Okay, this is our login model. Let's add properties like email and password. Now let's add this namespace into the underscore imports dot global file so that we can use the classes very easily into the component. Okay, using this namespace. Okay, now let's add a C# code in this Razor component inside of the code block. Okay, let me initialize our model, login model. Okay, so initialize our login model. Okay, now let's enable the two-way binding with this form. To do that, we can use @bind attribute. To that, I can pass my login model properties. Okay, like this. @bind password. Okay, let's create a click method also. So on clicking the button, we have to invoke a method. Inside that method, we have to invoke the login API call. Okay, so let me create a method like okay, this is my method. I want to invoke on clicking the submit button. So here I can register for @onClick method with my user login method. Now in this user login method, we have to invoke API, right? So let's create a logic files where we are going to implement all our API calls. Okay. For that, in the Blazor WebAssembly application, let's create a folder like logics. Inside of it, let's create a class file like API logic.cs. Okay. Okay. Now in the underscore imports.razor page, let's add this newly created namespace as well. Okay. Now in this API logic, let's inject the HTTP client factory. Okay. Okay. To use HTTP client factory, we need to install Microsoft.extensions.http NuGet package. So into our Blazor WebAssembly application, let's install the Microsoft.extensions.http NuGet package. Copy that. Go to Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay. Install it. Now try to import the HTTP client factory namespace. See. Now it is recognized. HTTP client factory. Let's implement the logic for invoking the our login API. So let's create a method for invoking the login API. So this method will have login model as a input. So it must be sent as a payload to the server, right? And next, first we need to get the HTTP client factory. Okay. So we need to create a HTTP client object from the client factory. To do that, first we need to register our domain in the program.cs file of the Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay. So here, what I will do, builder.services.add HTTP client factory. Here I am going to use named client technique. There are 4 different types of technique. In that named client technique, we are going to create the HTTP client instance based on the name registered in the program.cs file. So here I will give name like API. You can give any name. Okay. And options dot base address equal to new URI, and here we need to register our server URL. So what is my server URL? You go to our API project. Inside of the API project, go to properties and go for launch settings.json. Okay. Here, copy the HTTPS URL. Okay. And go to our Blazor WebAssembly application. Register here. Okay. Now I can create a HTTP client instance from the HTTP client factory using this name. Okay, so that HTTP client object will be generated with the configurations we declared here. Okay, so here now what I will do, HTTP client factory dot create client. To this client we need to pass the name of our registration. Okay, API. Okay, now we will get the HTTP client object. Now string payload. We need to format the serialize the payload. Okay. For that, JSON serializer. Okay. System.text.json. Serialize our login model. Okay. Now where content equal to new string content. Okay. Pass payload as first parameter and encoding dot UTF-8 format, and here we can specify payload is application/JSON type. Okay. Now what we can do, we can invoke the API call. So response equal to await client dot post async. Okay. Our request is login request is what? HTTP post method only, right? HTTP post, and our path will be auth/login, our server endpoint. So same endpoint defined here because origin domain will be available in the client object because we are using the named client. Okay. So define the path auth/login. Okay. And next part we have to pass our content. Okay. So if response dot is success status code means API call or login is successful, then we will return success. Okay. And else I will return some message like failed. Okay. So this is my uh, API logic, API invocation logic. Okay. Now let's create an interface for it like IAPI logic. So in this interface, let's define the method definition. Okay. Now in the program.cs file, let's register this services API logic and IAPI logic for scope level. Okay. And let's inherit that IAPI logic here. Okay. Now go to our login component at the top. Let's inject it. Okay. Now here in this method, let's implement the logic for invoking the API call. API call returning some success or failure message, right? So message equal to await API logic login async, and here we need to pass our login model. Okay. If message equal to successful success, then we need to implement something. If it is failed, we need to show some error message. Okay. Now let's run our Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay. And also when we are running our Blazor WebAssembly application, our API also should run. So first let's run our API project. Okay, my API project is up and running. Now let's run the Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay, before going to test our login form, I have forgot few configurations in my API project. Okay, let's implement them. So in the API project, I need to register the authentication middleware and also cookie service, auth cookie service. So go to program.cs file in the API project. Okay. Here, let me register my cookie service. Okay. Services dot add authentication. Here we need to specify the name of our authentication. So name of the authentication here we have already used, right? So let's copy that cookie authentication default authentication scheme. Okay. Paste it over here and import the namespace dot add cookie. Okay. That's the registration of our cookie service. Next, just above the use authorization, let's register our middleware, that is use authentication middleware. Okay. Okay. Now, if I go to my, this is my Blazor WebAssembly application that runs under browser, right? Here I don't have a link for clicking the login page. So here on the menu top, let's create a link for login page. Okay. So for that, go to our Blazor WebAssembly application. Let me create one shared component in the shared folder. I will name it like login display.razor component. Okay. So for now here, let me add simple anchor tag. href equal to slash login and login. Now let's import this shared component into menu layout after this anchor tag. Okay. Login display component. Okay, now rerun the Blazor WebAssembly application. Now here you can see the login link. Click on login link. We have login form. So let's open the developer tools to check the network calls. Okay. So I will give my registered user. Okay. Valid credentials I am giving. And here see, we got error. What is the error? Course issue. That is because our API project runs under localhost 7105 and our Blazor WebAssembly application runs under 7246. That means they are technically different domains. So in our API project, we should allow or implement course origin service. Okay, let's implement the cross origin service into our API project. So in the program.cs file, let's register course service. Okay, add course and options. Options dot add policy. We can define number of policies here. Okay, so this is my policy name. Course specs. Here I am going to allow any header, any method, any origin, but you can specify specific origins only in real project. Okay, so this is my service registration. So let's register the middleware here. So just above the authentication middleware, app dot use course and specify the policy name. So what is the name I have given? Course spec. Okay, now my API project will allow or can be consumed by any kind of other application. Okay, so let's rerun the API project. And one more small correction. In API project, for user entity is the table entity, right? So make them more specific, like nullable column, string, right? So from C#, this feature is available. So make them, they can accept nullable, okay? Based on your DB column. If your string column is not nullable, you no need to give. But my all columns are nullable, so I am giving this as well, okay? Now rerun the API project. Okay, now reload our Blazor WebAssembly page, inspect elements, okay, and give the credentials and check the developer tool. See, here is our login API call. Let's wait for the result. So it is successful. So here in the response, you can see success message, and in the cookies, you can observe a.asp.net cookie. So this is a authentication cookie, okay? That was successfully written as a response, okay? Now get back to our API project, Blazor WebAssembly project. Once the user is authenticated, what we have to do, okay? So it is a client application, right? So the Blazor WebAssembly, to make it is application is authenticated, something like in the header, if we have to hide login and show logout button, and next to it some user name, like that we have to show. Means we have to fetch some user information from the authenticated authentication process. But from the cookie, it is bad to read the cookie. Okay. And we cannot read also, because authentication cookie always HTTP only cookie. HTTP only cookie means cannot be read by the scripting frameworks. Okay. And it is also not ideal to read the cookie for the authentication as well. So what is the best idea? After successfully login, we need to call some API. That API will give some user information like a profile API. So after login, if we invoke that profile API, we can get some user information like email, name, right? So we can use that information and make our Blazor WebAssembly application as a authenticated app. Now in API projects, let's create the endpoint like profile where we will get the user information as a response in that API. Okay. So first let's create a model. So that model will be the response model of our profile API. Okay. So let's create a model like user profile DTO in our API project. Okay. Let's add the response model properties of the user profile DTO. Okay. Response model. Let's go to auth controller. Okay. And this API, let's add a method like user profile async. Okay. This method should be a HTTP GET. Okay. And define a route like user profile. Okay. And it should be decorated with authorize. Okay. Only authorized users can access this endpoint. Okay. And now what I will do, so for every API request, our authenticated cookie will be passed to the request, right? So we can read the claim. So what I will do, I want to read the user ID from the claim. Okay, so we are added user ID as a claim, right, to that cookie. So now I want to read it from the cookie now. So once the user is successfully authenticated with the cookie, our API project automatically reads the user information and it's stored into the HTTP context. Okay. and from the claims I want to read the user ID claim. So dot type equal to, so name of the claim, here what I give, user ID, right? User ID. So dot select. So I want to convert that value into integer. Okay. So dot value I want to read. Okay. So dot first. So once I got user ID, I'm going to query my DB. Okay. So where user profile equal to await my cookie context user where user ID equal to our user ID and select, and let's map all the data into our user profile DTO. Dot first default async, and finally return that user profile response. Okay, so we are ready with the user profile API. Now we should invoke once the user is authenticated with our Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay, how to consume it in our Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay, let's understand it, how to implement it. After successful login, I must call user profile API, and the data should be binded here as a authenticated user information. So what we think, whether we can store it in a variable, okay, and register that variable, means where we will create a property like user profile DTO in Blazor WebAssembly also, and that class will be registered as a scope and or singleton, and we want to maintain the state. Okay, but that is not the ideal case. Okay, so another way of doing is Blazor WebAssembly itself supports some authorization where we can add claims for authentication. So my plan is, now I want to add my user profile data as a claims to the authenticate state provider. Okay, so Blazor WebAssembly for authorization means to make WebAssembly authentication, it should use authenticate state provider. Okay, so to customize that authenticate state provider, we must implement it. Okay, so for implementing the authenticate state provider and integrating the authorization into the Blazor WebAssembly application, we need to install one NuGet package. Okay, so first let's install that package. The package we have to install into our Blazor WebAssembly application is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.Blazor WebAssembly Authentication. Okay, let's copy that. So let's install the package. After installing package, we have to import few namespaces. So go to underscore imports.razor page, okay, and import namespaces like Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization and at the rate using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.Authorization. Okay, these two namespaces must be implemented, and we have to register services like go to program.cs5 and register services like builders.services.add options. Okay, and next builder.services.add authorization code. Okay, these two services need to be registered. Now let's implement our custom authentication state provider. Okay, so to do that, let's create a new folder. So let's create a folder like providers. Inside of it, let's create a class like custom auth state provider.cs. Okay, to make it authentication state provider, we must inherit authentication state provider. So that imports from namespace Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Component.Authorization, which is the library we have just installed. Okay. So on inheriting authentication state provider, there is a abstract method which we need to implement. Okay. So that is get authentication state method. So it returns authentication state. So this is the state that contains authenticated user information. Okay. So implicitly our authentication state provider or Blazor WebAssembly application calls this method to get the authentication state provider. Okay. So to make our Blazor WebAssembly application authenticated, what we will do, we will invoke our profile API, okay, and that response we will add as a claims and return from here as a authentication state provider. Okay, so now what I will do, I will declare a variable or initialize a variable like client's principal. Okay, client's principal, and it should take identity, client's identity. Okay, so what I will do here from this method, I will initialize new authentication state provider authentication state, and it is expecting client's principal as an object. Okay, and so currently it is empty, right? Our client's identity, that means user is not authenticated. Okay, so now what we have to do, let's register this namespace into our imports. So where is our imports file? Here, and next we are implemented, right, authentication state provider. It must be registered in the scope level in the program.cs file. So here we need to register it, builder.services.add scope. Okay, and authentication state provider, and then our custom auth state provider. Okay, we need to register like this. Once we implemented authentication state provider, and to inject this authentication state into our Blazor WebAssembly application in app.razor page. Okay, this is the entry component of our Blazor application. Okay, so what we have to do, we have to implement the cascading authentication state property. Okay, because of this, okay, by encapsulating everything under this component, it will pass a cascading property like authentication state property. So Blazor components can read that property and can understand whether a user is authenticated or not. Okay, so we have to add that, and along with that, let's change this route view to authorize route view. Okay, so those are the changes we required. Okay, and now let's implement our uh, user profile API logic into our API logic file in the Blazor WebAssembly. Okay, go to API logics, Here, let's implement a new method for getting the user profile information. So before creating the user profile method, let's create the response type. What is the response type of our user profile? User profile DTO, right? Exactly same model we have to create in our Blazor WebAssembly as well. Okay. So in the models, I will create a class like user profile model. So this is our user profile model, right? Let's copy the properties from our API project. Okay. So now let's go to our API logic class. Let's create a new class for invoking the profile API. So let's create a HTTP client instance. For that, let's copy this line. Okay. We will get the HTTP client instance. And next, we are going to do response equal to await client dot get async. Okay. And here we need to pass our profile API. So what is our profile endpoint path? The profile, right? Copy it from our API project and define it here. Okay. So if response.is status code means if response is successful. So here I want to return a message as well as the response object as well. So for that I will use a tuple here. Okay, string message and user profile model. So user profile. Okay, so if it is successful, I will simply return success as a message and the response. So to read the response, response dot content dot read from JSON async. Okay, which is the extension of system.net.http JSON. Okay, and here you can specify your type. If status is not success, so in that case, else in the else we will check for a specific condition like response dot status code equal to http status code dot unauthorized. Okay, means user is not a non-authenticated user trying to access the API. At that time, we'll simply return like unauthorized. Okay, and we'll return null. If at all any other exception, we will return like failed and return null as a response. Okay, so that is our logic for invoking the user profile API. So let's define this method name into high profile logic. Okay, so we have implemented logic as well. So where we want to invoke this API call. So let's go to Login.razor. So after successful login, we have to call, right? So instead of directly calling at the login.razor page, I want to refresh the page. Okay. While refreshing, I want to call the API object, API information. Okay. So what is the use of calling at the API information? User profile at the reloading of the page. The benefit is if the user closes our application or user reloads our Blazor WebAssembly application, at the time our authentication state will be lost. Till now we haven't set any authentication state, but it will be lost when we reload the page or when we close the application and we come after some time and open the page, state will be lost. But actually we are logged in, but state will be lost. So that is why it is better to call the user profile information on every page reload. Okay. So before writing that logic, I need to write a one method here, okay, so that on successful response API logic, wherever we call our user profile async, once that is success, when you get the response, we have to update that response into our authentication state, right? So to do that, I want to write a method here so that our authentication state gets updated. Okay. So to do that, what I will do, I will write a method like set auth info. Okay. To this method, our user profile model passed as a input parameter. Okay. I will store the response as a claims. Okay. And that claims I will create as a new claims principal object, and I will assign that object to this variable. So this variable is used by our authentication state provider, right? So it gets updated. So what I will do, I will create a new claims identity. Okay. Claims identity, and here I want to pass array of claims. So new claim, I want to pass the email as one of the claim that will come from our email, right? Sorry, our user profile information, right? I will use that. And one more thing, I will write like claim type like name. So using first name, last name, I am going to frame the name. Okay. So user profile dot first name space user profile dot last name. I am framing the name claim here. And next I want to store ID as well, user ID. So user ID, custom claim name, and user profile dot user ID dot toString. Okay. Here we have initialized collection of identity. And here one more thing, here we need to specify the authentication type. You have to give some name. Okay. Otherwise, it won't reflect in authentication state. Okay. So I will give like cookie auth. Any name, it is fine. Okay. Next, I want to assign it to this variable. Claims principal, new claim principal identity. Okay. So assigning like this, we are changing the claims data, means making the user authenticated. We are adding some custom data, some user information as a claims. But to refresh this authentication state, we have to use one notification method, that is notification authentication state change. So this will reflect the authentication state change. Wherever we use authentication state provider property, cascading property in components, that gets refreshed. So to this method, we have to pass our get authenticate async method as the input parameter. So now come back to our case where to call our user profile API. I want to call at page reload, right? So how I can do means go to app.razor page. Here on every navigation, on navigate async method will be invoked. Okay, here route component is there, right? So on this, there is a method like on navigation async. Okay, this gets executed for every route, Okay, so on page reload also it's get invoked. So at that time I want to invoke my API call. Okay, so for that let's create a method private async task. I will give same name for my method. Can give any name. I am giving same name. Okay, and it's going to receive navigation context. Okay, so here I want to invoke my API call. So to invoke the API call, we have to inject our IAPI logic. Okay, at the rate inject API logic, API logic. Okay, so register this method here to this event at the rate prefix with at the rate. Okay, and here what I can do where response equal to await. Okay, API logic dot user profile async method. Okay, so if response message equal to success, okay, API call is success means that means user is authenticated and we got data. In that case, we need to pass our user profile response to this set auth info method in the custom auth state provider. So to invoke that into our AppRazor component, we must inject the authentication state provider. Okay, auth state provider because it is inheriting, right? This is the base class. That's why we have to inject it. But it is the default from the framework. But how we can call, since it is injected, we can typecast and call this method. Okay. So now what I will do, authentication state provider as custom auth state provider. Okay, I am converting it because I cannot inject custom state provider as a into the component because it is inheriting the authentication state provider. So we need to inject the authentication state provider only. We cannot inject the custom state provider. So now we can call set auth info and response dot user profile. I am passing it. Okay. So if it is not successful, okay, something like if it is unauthorized, then we have to add some logic here. Okay. So once the state is updated, we want to show logout button and username in the menu, right? For that, what we will do, go to login display component. Okay. We going to change this component. Okay. So now I have enabled or installed the Blazor WebAssembly authentication library, right? So I have a default component like authorize view. Okay. So this contains two child components that are like authorized. Okay. Content inside of this will gets rendered when user is authenticated. Means authentication state provider contains the user information at that time. And another component that is not authenticated. So okay, sorry, not authenticated, not authorized. Okay. So this will content will be displayed when the user is not authenticated. Okay. Now here at the rate anchor tag I will use href nothing. Here I want to display the profile name. So to read the data from the auth state provider into the authorized view component, we can use context dot. This is only work for the authorized view component. Okay. Context dot user dot identity. Okay. Identity dot name. So here I want to display the name of the authenticated user. And next I want to add the button. Okay. Of type button class. Now let's add some bootstrap. Okay. On clicking this button, I want to implement the logout functionality, which we will implement in upcoming steps. Not presently, it is not yet completed Logout API. So let's leave like this. And in the not authorized content, let's add our previous href link, that is login. Okay. So href equal to / login. Okay. Okay. Now let's rerun our Blazor WebAssembly application and test the authentication. Okay. Let's go to our application and it's reloaded. Okay. And I want to refresh immediately once the user is authenticated, right? So what I will do in the Blazor WebAssembly application to refresh the page once the user is successfully authenticated, go to Login.razor. Okay. Here at the rate inject navigation manager. Okay. Inject the navigation manager. So using this navigation manager, navigate to. Okay. Is not synchronous. Okay. Navigate to home page once it is authenticated. But I want to refresh and go to home page. For that, I can force reload by passing boolean value true here. Okay. So let's save our application and run the Blazor server application. Now, once I successfully logged in, API is successful. I am automatically redirected to home page by reloading the page. Okay. Networks, let's clear all the existing calls and call the API. Let's wait, let's wait. See, page is reloaded, redirected to landing page. Okay, but here we didn't get any authenticated values. User profile is not authenticated. See, I am getting 404 unauthorized, but login is successful. Cookie is added, but user is not authenticated because cookie is not transferring along with the request. Okay. In the request header, do you see any cookie? No, right? That is because by since our domains are different, right? Our Blazor WebAssembly application and server application domains are different. So credentials automatically will not be attached. We should make them attached. So to do that, we have to write a HTTP delegate handler. Okay. So we implement the HTTP delegate handler first. So in the Blazor WebAssembly application, create a new folder like handlers. Okay. And create a file like cookie handler. Okay. To implement delegate handler, we have to implement delegate handler. Okay. And inside of it, we have to override so this is the method we have to override. If you want, you can go to the definition. So this is the sending method we are overriding. Okay. If you have any doubt, you just copy from here. Method name and those things. Okay. And give it over here. Okay. So inside of it, what we have to do means, so what will happen means, whenever API call invoked, this delegate handler is registered for that API domain. Before going to server, it will bypass here, means it will, this method gets executed. Whatever logic we added, that's going to affect the API request. Okay. So inside of it, what we will do, request dot set browser request credentials. So from this you can understand authenticated cookie means is a credentials. So browser it will store in browser, right? We are requesting to add the authenticated cookies of that domain, API domain. Okay. Browser credentials dot include. Okay. Next return. This means resume to invoke the API. So here what we are doing while bypassing before going to API, just we are informing the request. Please do add the credentials from the browser for this domain if there are anything in the browser. So we will have a cookie, right? Login cookie. That cookie will be attached. Okay, and this should be registered. The program.cs file. Okay. So in the program.cs file, builder.service dot add scope. Okay. Here we need to register like this instance, and then we have to add here as a delegate handler. So message handler, and we need to pass our delegate handler. Okay. So any domain, any API request of this domain will automatically intercepted by this delegate handler. Okay. So save our Blazor server application and rerun the application. Now if I go to, it is reloading. Okay. See, in the network call, still it is unauthorized, 404. Okay. Let me refresh again page. A page reload, user profile is calling, but that is unauthorized. But we in the request header, now we can see cookie is added, right? User information cookie is added. But we are getting error. What is the response? 404. And if you go to console, here you can see still server is not allowing because credentials are including. Means if we go to our API project, okay, program.cs, here we have to specify allow the credentials as well. Okay. So to do that, allow credentials. But when you use credentials, now if you run the application will fail because it won't accept the allow or any origin. So we should not use this. What we have to use means set origins allowed and default as a boolean true so that it will allow any origin. Okay, but don't use allow any origin directly when you use allow credentials. Okay, you should use set origin allowed, then only it will work. Okay, so save it and rerun the API project. Okay, refresh our Blazor WebAssembly application. See, profile is now that cross origin issue is gone, but still profile is unauthenticated. Why? Maybe cookie has expired. Let's log in again. Login not working. Go to Blazor WebAssembly application. Login display component. Okay, it is href. Okay. Rerun the project. Okay, page is refreshed. So click on login, enter credentials. Okay. Networks clear here. So login. API call invoked. See, it is refreshed. And now see, my data is populated and logout button is displaying. Means I have successfully authenticated Blazor WebAssembly also by adding my custom claims into it by customizing the authentication state provided. Okay. So if I refresh also, I still get user information. State is not lost because on reload or on every navigation, I am calling this API call. But there is a drawback here. So if I click on counter, see again user API call is called, profile API call. If I go to home again, one more call. That is because, okay, that is because app.razor on navigate method executes for every route navigation, whether it is a paid reload or normal Blazor single page navigation also, this method get executed. So here we need to add some conditions so that it cannot be invoked unwantedly. Okay. So how we can implement conditions? Okay. Or suppose if the authentication state provider contains login data, we no need to call user profile, right? We no need to call user profile. So let's fetch the user profile information. So here to fetch the user generally in any component, okay, you want to get the cascading authentication state provider. For example, in the code side, if I want authenticated user information, I can use cascading property. Okay, authentication state provider. Okay, this like this cascading parameter. Why this is a cascading parameter? Because on top, the root component is cascading authentication state provider. It has a input parameter that is auth state, authentication state. Okay, to read this authentication state. Okay, to read this authentication state, we should use cascading property because it is a parent component property, and from this authentication state we can get the user information. But that is after executing the app.razor, right? So like this I cannot use in app.razor. If I use also it won't work because after this component app.browser component and inside we have navigation, right? here in this component, we don't have access to this authentication state provider because inside of this only it is executing. So we cannot use this property like this. But what we can do, we can inject or use our custom authentication state provider here directly. So for that, what we will do, see, only call, let's go to custom authentication provider. I am going to consume this method here in this program.cs file in the app.razor. So only for app.razor only call this method. Remaining wherever you want, you have to use the property I have just shown, right? This property you should use. You cannot call this method directly, okay? You can use, but that is a wrong way of implementation. Okay, don't use like that. So since here I don't have a scope to access the property, I'm directly consuming the custom authentication state provider method. So here I need to, I have already injected authentication state provider. Okay, now what I can do, where user equal to this property conversion dot get async. Okay, from this I want user. You can get user. Okay, like this. So I will get the user information. Now what I can do, if user dot is identity dot is authenticated. Authenticate whenever it is authenticated, we no need to invoke the profile API, right? So if not authentic, okay, sorry, this condition won't stop execution of API call. Okay, condition we cannot avoid the unwanted call, right? So what we can do, what we will do, once the user is successfully logged in, go to login display, go Login.razor component. Here, I want to set a variable into the local browser storage. So to do that, I need to install a one more library, okay, to usually communicate with the local browser storage from Blazor WebAssembly. We need to install one more NuGet package because user information here we fetched, right? This alone can't prevent the unwanted API calls. Along with this, we need to have one persisted data value that represents user is already authenticated, but user information is not available. At that time only, we need to call this API. So for that, let's first store that variable. To store that variable, we need to install one library. Okay, let me install Blazor local storage. This library must be installed into our Blazor WebAssembly. So it will help to save the data into the browser local storage. Okay, so install it. Install it. Once the library is installed, go to imports.razor and here we need to call the namespace like local storage. Okay, and we need to register the service also in the program.cs file. Services dot add Blazor local storage. Okay, and now go to our login.razor component. Here inject iLocal storage service that's come from the NuGet package just we have installed. Okay, and here on successful login, we will store some variable, any variable Okay, that represent user is authenticated. Local storage dot set. So key value pair, right, is authenticated. Okay, I will store some boolean value. Value will be doesn't matter here for me. Okay, so once the user is successfully authenticated, this variable is available in the local storage, right? So what we can do in in app.razor, let's inject my local storage. Okay, so here we will try to get the value like auth value variable. Okay, await underscore local storage get item string async, and we need to pass the key. So what is my key? This is my key. Store the key here. Okay, now condition what I can write means if string.auth variable exists means local storage we have saved user is authenticated means that is successfully authenticated. Okay, string dot is null or empty, and our user dot identity is not authenticated. See here, I am applying reverse reverse condition, not authenticated. But browser storage contains user is authenticated, but our state is not updated. Okay, this happens when user is logged in, page reloads, state doesn't exist, right? Means a user API call is doesn't call. At that time, it will be false only. At that time only, we want to invoke the API. Cut this and keep it inside. Okay, now when this is user profile API calls, when the browser local storage contains variable like is authenticated, it's only available when the user is logged in successfully. Okay, and our state is empty. At that time only you call user profile. So user profile response updates the state again, right? And in the else, if the API is not what I say, if API got some exception or it is expired, cookie is expired, but our local storage variable will be available, right? At that time, cookie might expire and user profile got unauthorized. At that time, we have to remove local storage variable so that we can again avoid the unwanted calls. Okay, here in the else, we have to remove the local storage variable. So copy this line and change the method to remove. Okay. Okay, now rerun our Blazor server application and test whether we are able to avoid the unwanted profile API calls. Page reloaded, cookie expired seems okay. Now login. Page is reloading. Okay, now I got authenticated user information. So if I navigate between the pages, okay, if I navigate, go to networks, clear the, if I navigate, see, user profile is not calling. That is because we have successfully handled. Or suppose if I reload page and I want to show the local storage value as well. In the applications, we go to local storage, see is authenticated is saved, right? Variable is successfully saved. If I reload, network call C, user profile is called. Because once we reload, authentication state will be lost. Okay. And if I navigate between the routes, it is not invoking. So perfectly, we have avoided the unwanted user profile calls. Now let's implement the logout information. So logout means clearing the cookie, right? So for that, first let's implement the logout endpoint in our API. Okay. So let's create a action method like logout async in my API project. Okay. I want this should be HTTP post. Okay, and route logout. Okay. Here we simply use await HTTP context sign in we have used for authentication, right? HTTP context sign out. There is another method. Sign in for login, sign out for logout. Okay. You can log out and simply return okay. Okay, that is my API method. So rerun the API project. Now we have to invoke the logout API from our Blazor WebAssembly application. Go to our API logic file. So let's implement a method for invoking the logout API call. Okay, so it will clear the cookie at the server. Okay, let's copy the line. And I want to invoke as a post, right? So response equal to await client dot post async post. So first will be the parameter path of our logout. Okay, so this is my path of my API, and here content, there is no content. I can simply pass null. There is no payload for this. Okay, if response dot is status code success, then I will simply return success. Means that the logout is successful. Else I can simply return failed. Okay, that is my method to invoke the logout API. So let's define the definition, method definition. Okay, so our logout, where we have our logout is in login display component. So go over there. Now we have to create a method private async task logout. Okay, this method must be invoked here on click of the button. Okay, so first we have to invoke the API call, right? So inject API call, inject IE API logic. Okay, here what I can do, await API logic dot logout async. Okay, this will clear the cookie at the server. Response equal to. Okay, then if response equal to success, when API successfully removed the authentication cookie, then we simply remove, okay, browser local storage variable auth, and we just refresh the page. That's it. Logout session on the page also removed. Okay, so at the rate inject local storage service, local storage. Okay, so here what I will do, I will remove the local storage variable, remove item. So the name, remove item, and I want to reload the page. So for that I can use @inject navigation manager. Okay, underscore navigation manager dot await. Sorry, navigate to. I want to go to home page. I want to reload. For that I want to force it. True. That's it. Our page, our Blazor WebAssembly application also lost its state for authentication. Okay, let's rerun the application. Okay, here we can see login, right? So let's click on logout button, and also you can see this local storage variable as well. Okay, here is our logout. So if I click on logout, okay, it is logged out successfully, and go to network calls. Logout is 200, and go to application. There is no local storage variable, and here you can see no login, and you can see on no login also profile API call will not invoke. You go to networks, no profile API call, no profile API call, because we are handling there. Whenever we have local storage, at that time only we are trying to invoke the profile API call. Okay, so that's it. Blazor WebAssembly authentication with cookie-based authentication, how we have to implement. Okay, one last time, let's log in. Successfully logged in. You can navigate to any page, okay, and log out. It is successfully logged out. Okay, so that's all about the cookie-based authentication in Blazor WebAssembly application. Okay, in the next video, I am going to show Facebook, okay, external login provider, how to authenticate cookie-based authentication with Facebook also. Okay, that is the second video. I hope this video has delivered some useful information to you all. If you like my video, please support me by subscribing to my channel. Soon we are going to meet with new videos. Until then, signing off.